Oh la la. Oh, yeah.
People like games.
What up, folks? It's Reggie with People Like Games, and this week on a new episode of Story Mode, we're talking about Pokemon. Not much else to say. It's the biggest franchise in the world and one of my favorite game series since childhood. But it's been about 25 years, over 100 games, almost 1,000 Pokemon. There's a lot of history. So much so that I'm going to do a little series on it, which starts with the origin of Pokemon right now. As you know, on Story Mode, we like to go back and explore the creators a little bit, so we start with the legend himself, Satoshi Tajiri. Tajiri grew up in rural Tokyo, catching bugs and small animals, showing them off to his class, who would give him the nickname the Bug Professor. As the city rapidly grew and arcades sprung up, he would earn a new nickname, the Storm of the Arcade, for his skills and ability to stay on arcade machines all day with barely any pocket change. Tajiri spent so much time at the arcade, and he wanted to share everything he'd learned with his friends. So he began writing guides with tips and tricks to help the other players, and would spend so much time on the games and guides that he barely graduated. By the time he did graduate, he didn't really care about college. At 18, Tajiri would take his guides a step further and created his own handmade magazine known as Game Freak, which was also his pen name as a freelance writer. The small operation was done at home, handwritten and drawn by Tajiri himself, doing much the same of what he was doing before. Soon, a small following would come around, and Game Freak's popularity would spike with their issue on Xevious, a classic arcade scrolling shooter that Tajiri fell in love with. The issue dedicated to Xevious would sell over 100,000 copies and gave Tajiri his first real step into the video game industry. After some time, Ken Sugimori, who had just been kicked out of his house by his parents for his artistic aspirations, would hit up Tajiri for a spot as an illustrator at Game Freak after finding one of their copies in his store. With the release of the Famicom in 1983, Tajiri knew he wanted to take Game Freak off the page and into the console. The idea of Pokemon was already in its infancy at this point, as Tajiri had already been planning a game based on his childhood catching creatures, but he needed to establish a relationship with Nintendo if he wanted the game on their platform. After a few solid games, Tajiri would meet Shigeru Miyamoto, who acted as a mentor for all of Game Freak as they learned what game development was all about. In 1989, Game Freak officially became a game developer, and Nintendo would agree to support it over the 6-year development of Tajiri's Capsule Monsters. Game Freak struggled over the span of development. Money was hard, and Tajiri could hardly afford to pay his staff, leading to 5 members of the team quitting. Sugimori would stay on through the transition to game development and would single-handedly draw the art for all of the original 151 Pokemon. Anyone who's seen some classic Generation 1 Pokemon art will no doubt recognize Sugimori's signature style, which my editor will show off now. While the game was originally based on collecting and battling monsters, Dragon Quest and the Link Cable would inspire the final component of Pokemon, trading. In their spare time, Sugimori and Tajiri would play Dragon Quest and compare their adventures. Tajiri got frustrated when he realized Sugimori had 2 Madcap items and he had yet to find one. With the Link Cable, which had just been released with the new Game Boy, Tajiri saw the possibility of players trading their items and monsters to help each other. Like many of the other classic Japanese games we've covered on Story Mode, go check out the Dragon Quest, combat was approached with the idea of simplicity. Inspired by other JRPGs like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, it was stripped down to only 4 actions per monster. And as he does, Shigeru Miyamoto added the final touch that would go on to be a staple of this series to this day when he suggested they release Pokemon as 2 separate games with their own exclusive monsters in each to encourage trading. Thus, February 1996, the game was released officially as Pocket Monsters Red and Green in Japan, only gaining the name Pokemon when it was shortened by localizers. Pocket Monsters Blue released in October of the same year as an update to the infamously glitchy Red and Green. Spoiler alert, Blue is still really glitchy. After the massive success of his brand new series, Tajiri put his media skills to work making sure that the public wouldn't forget about Pokemon. Game Freak approached the massive Japanese publisher Shogakukan to create the first Pokemon manga, starring a talking Clefairy that was originally intended to be the series' mascot. In the same year, and right around the release of Pokemon Blue, the Pokemon card game was published by Media Factory, setting off a whole new way to collect, battle, and trade Pokemon. Only a few months later, the Pokemon anime began its broadcast in April in Japan and solidified Pokemon's presence in just about every medium. By the time it reached the US in 1998, Pokemon was already one of Japan's biggest hits and of course would see just as great success overseas. Pokemon's dominance in cards, games, and media has made it the ultimate collector's game, beating out competitors like Digimon and Yu-Gi-Oh! For over 2 decades. Almost everyone in the world would recognize a Pikachu at this point, and that's not going to change anytime soon. As the series continued to grow, it would begin to foster a massive competitive battling scene that's dramatically changed over the next 3 generations. But that's for next time, when I give you a rundown on some of the biggest changes to Pokemon battle mechanics and the impact they've had on professional play. So in the comments, let me know some of your favorite facts about Pokemon and Generation 1, and maybe we could do a bonus video on some of that. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, all that good stuff. We'll see you next time. Welcome back, folks, to part 2 of the People Like Games Pokemon miniseries. If you haven't seen part 1 already, check the link below for your crash course on the origins of Pokemon. But today, we're focusing on the ways that Pokemon has evolved its battle mechanics to create a deceivingly complex system, growing competitive battle pretty much into an esport all on its own. There's not much to say about Gen 1's battle mechanics, as they're easily the simplest of the main series games. Each Pokemon had 5 stats, being HP, attack, defense, special, and speed, and was restricted to 4 moves at a time. Attacking moves can use either the special or attack stat, depending on the move's type. Remember that because it's going to be important later. The first big step in developing Pokemon battles was Generation 2's addition of held items, the function of which can vary greatly and even completely turn the tide of a match. Berries were also introduced in this generation and are some of the most common held items even to this day. In Gold and Silver, there were only about 10 berries available, 7 of which were to cure a specific status effect. The Mystery Berry used to restore a move's PP, while the Berry and Gold Berry could heal 10 and 30 HP respectively. Other held items were introduced, and these mostly focused on powering up specific move types. Later generations would add even more items with a range of effects, dramatically increasing the utility of just about every Pokemon in existence. But held items weren't the only big change in Gen 2, as Pokemon base stats were fundamentally changed also. Now Pokemon had 6 stats, with special being divided into special attack and special defense. Where in Generation 1, a Pokemon like Chansey was phenomenal at using special both offensively and defensively, in Generation 2, its stats were altered, leaving it with an abysmal 35 special attack. Now Chansey's just a special wall rather than an all-around threat. Moving on to the Hoenn region, Generation 3 added, in my opinion, one of the greatest elements of Pokemon battle, abilities. From this point on, every single Pokemon would naturally have an ability that was often, but not always, meant to help in battle. A few exceptions like Pickup and Generation 8's Ball Fetch are pretty useful for a normal playthrough. A prime example of abilities, though, comes in the form of Intimidate. Fan favorites like Gyarados and Arcanine possess this ability, which automatically lowers the opposing Pokemon's attack stat by 1 stage upon entering battle. Nowadays, many Pokemon have 2 potential abilities when caught in the wild, and even more that we'll get to when we talk about Gen 5. Abilities weren't Hoenn's only addition, though, as Natures also made their first appearance here. The most important thing to know about Natures is that they determine stat growth. While most of the 25 Natures will increase 1 stat while losing in another, the hardy, docile, serious, bashful, and quirky Natures have no effect. Let's take the Adamant Nature for an example. Adamant Nature increases a Pokemon's attack stat by 10% and loses that 10% in its special attack. While that 10% doesn't seem like a lot, you only need to watch some theory crafting on YouTube to see how important even a 1% increase can be. By Generation 3, almost everything was in place to create the perfect battle system, but it couldn't finally be done until Generation 4 knocked out some relics of Gen 1 mechanics. Earlier I said that Pokemon moves were determined by their type, and for the first 3 generations, this was true. Types like Fire, Water, and Grass fell under Special, and thus would use Special Attack to determine damage based on the opponent's special defense. Normal Fighting and Ghost, for who the hell knows what reason, were all considered physical moves and would use the attack stat to target the opponent's defense stat. While it seemed simple enough, this presented a lot of problems for a variety of Pokemon whose stats didn't match up with their typing. Let's look at one of my favorites, Gengar. Gengar is easily one of the most famous special attackers of the series, even to this day, but you might already see a problem here. The Ghost Poison type did nothing but hurt its offensive capabilities in Gens 1 through 3. Being a special attacker, it couldn't make effective use of stab moves because both of its type fell into the physical category. Stab, or same type attack bonus, amplifies an attack by 1.5 times and is usually your most reliable source of damage. So how did Gen 4 fix it? With what is referred to among fans as the physical special split. In Gen 4, Pokemon moves would no longer be determined by type and would actually each get their own physical or special designation. Sludge Bomb, a powerful poison type move, which is now considered a special move, would finally be a viable option for a Pokemon like Gengar. As we saw with the hype around the remakes, Gen 4 is easily a fan favorite, and it makes sense why. At this point in the series, just about everything had finally come together to create a seamless battle system, and competitive Pokemon battling would continue to grow massively. So what do you do when you've just about made the perfect iteration of your game? Reboot it, of course. What's up, folks? It's Reggie, welcoming you back to part 3 of our Pokemon retrospective, where we're taking a look back at what shaped the series into what it is today. If you haven't already, go check out parts 1 and 2, links below, where we covered the origins and the development of the current Pokemon battle system. Today, though, we're going to focus in on one of the most controversial generations of Pokemon as we look back at the development of Pokemon Black and White, the soft reboot. In episode 1, we introduced the father of Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri, and the rise of his company, Game Freak. But he wasn't the only one at its inception. Junichi Masuda was also there from day one. Masuda was a lot like Tajiri in childhood. He spent his vacations fishing and catching bugs on the island of Kyushu. But unlike Tajiri, Masuda found his first love in school, where he picked up the trombone, which just so happened to be my instrument in middle school. He would become hooked on music, collecting all sorts of classics and studying the greats. It wasn't just those, but it'd take me all day to list all of his musical interests. Like many who loved art, though, Masuda doubted that he could make a career of it, so he studied programming in college. When he got out, Tajiri's Game Freak had just shifted its focus to game development, and Masuda was hired not just for his computer skills, but also his love of music as Game Freak's first composer. From the very beginning, with Game Freak's first game, Quinty, Masuda would be the lead composer. So when it was time for the development of Pokemon, of course Masuda was right back in the composer's chair, also helping a bit with programming on the side. After its massive success, Masuda was handpicked by Tajiri as a sub-director of the follow-up titles, Gold and Silver. And when it was time for Tajiri to step down, he fully handed Masuda the title of director. Masuda would go on to create the Hoenn region based on his childhood in Kyushu, much like Tajiri did with the Kanto region. I don't need to remind you, but Generation 3 and 4, once again, massive hits, and cemented Masuda's place in the franchise outside of just music. To Shiny Hunters, the name Masuda is pretty familiar, as he's the king for the implementation of the Masuda method, a feature he added in Gen 4 to help promote global trade. If you didn't know, the Masuda method massively increased the chance of breeding a Shiny when breeding Pokemon from 2 different real-world regions. Back to the topic, we jump to Masuda touring for the release of Generation 4. Masuda would take heavy inspiration from the architecture and people of New York City. He picked out things like the Brooklyn Bridge and Central Park and experienced fans of Pokemon who came from various races and walks of life. He took these back with him when he sat down to create the Unova region based almost directly on New York City. This would be the first time a Pokemon region was based outside of Japan, and they take it a step further to differentiate from the previous titles. Masuda wanted to recapture the feeling of the first Pokemon games, and to do that, he made the most controversial decision before Sword and Shield's exit, which was the removal of all previous generation Pokemon until the post-game. Players were forced to work with 156 never-before-seen Pokemon to progress, putting experienced players on the same level as brand new fans of the series. At the same time, older players were considered throughout development, as Masuda felt a need to age up the series, up with the fans who started the explosion of the Pokemon franchise in the first place. Pokemon designs were meant to be less cute and more cool, which would give way to more sharp-edged designs, and a more meaningful story was implemented to appeal to older players. The design of this world took on a much more modern feel than previous titles. The urban-based setting would lend itself not only to world design, but it would go on to influence Pokemon designs and even NPCs, ultimately helping bring about the theme of Generation 5, opposites working together. This culminated in the box art legends, Reshiram and Zekrom, representing truth and ideals respectively. Pokemon like Pidove take obvious inspiration from the pigeons rampant in the city, while Watchog is clearly derivative of crossing guards. Now we could go on and on about these designs, but they did stir a lot of controversy at the time for what we should call uninspired design, at least according to some. Take Chandelure and Klinklang, for example, literal chandeliers and gears. I'm not even going to touch Vanillish, but I'll mention that it was designed by Pokemon's first Western designer, James Turner. Just know that there was definitely a lot of thought going into these Pokemon, whether you think they look like Digimon or not. Back to NPCs, they would finally have varying skin tones, inspired by the mixed salad New York represented. They went a step further, introducing the series' first Black gym leader and first female professor, the latter courtesy of the legend himself, Ken Sugimori. Coming from Japan's nearly 98% homogeneous population, this was a massive step in modernizing Pokemon and including just that much more representation. Many features like rotation battles and triple battles were added to create more variety, although Gen 5 was the only place they would be seen. Like Gold and Silver introduced day and night cycles, Black and White would introduce seasons, which would further change how you interacted with the environment, as well as certain in-game events. But probably the most unprecedented aspect of Generation 5 were the sequels. As of now, Black and White are the only games to feature direct sequels as opposed to a third version, like Yellow or Crystal, with Pokemon Black and White 2. Like all Pokemon games, Generation 5 sold insanely well, and to this day, Black and White remain the fastest DS titles to sell 5 million copies. Critical reception was mostly through the roof, but the Pokemon community seemed pretty on the fence at the time. The exclusion of previous Pokemon was pretty off-putting to some, while the designs were hit or miss depending on who you talk to. A young Reggie went so far as to not complete Generation 5 for many years out of sheer hatred for, you guessed it, Pokemon like Vanillish, and I still hate it. But over the years, sentiment has changed significantly, including mine. From where I stand, the Pokemon community has made a huge turnaround in their attitude towards Generation 5. Many of its Pokemon are some of the competitive scene's biggest threats, and looking back, it's the same kind of game that players like myself are asking for now. A fresh start gave rise to a whole new learning experience for everyone, pros and new players alike. We often talk about Generation 5 as a reboot of the franchise, but I think it was more of a reboot of the player base than the game itself. Not much really changed at the heart of Pokemon, but we were all forced to look at the world of Pokemon through a new, unfamiliar lens. So if you haven't already, go play a Generation 5 game before the remakes eventually come out. A lot of people will tell you that it's only downhill from there, but I'll save that for next time because we're going to talk about what I like to call the gimmick generation of Pokemon. So here we are for the final part of our Pokemon retrospective, where we've been covering the history, development, and gameplay changes of Pokemon that got us to where we are today. If you haven't already, check the links below for the first 3 parts where we covered the origins, battle mechanics, and the soft reboot. Today, we're going to take a look at the current era of Pokemon, starting with Generation 6, or what I like to call the gimmick era of Pokemon. And while a lot of these ideas were cool in concept, their poor implementation, lack of staying power, and overall quality of the games surrounding them have led to this being one of the most divisive, dare I say, worst stretches of Pokemon games. Don't take this the wrong way. I was basically born with a Game Boy in hand, and I've been behind this series ever since, but the Pokemon Company needs to drastically change to keep up with the times and realize their audience consists of more than just the new children discovering the game for the first time. So sit back while I explain to you where all this hate is coming from and why a game like the upcoming Pokemon Legends Arceus is my biggest hope for the franchise going forward. It all starts with Generation 6, Pokemon X and Y. Side note, these are still the only games in the series, aside from Gen 8 with its DLC, without any sort of follow-up title. The long-awaited Pokemon Z is gone. And I'll be real for a second, aside from the gimmick of Mega Evolution being the coolest thing to happen to Pokemon to date, this was probably one of the worst games from a veteran's perspective. Last week, I told you about the consideration given to veteran players as well as newbies with the release of Generation 5. But somewhere along the way, veterans were dropped off, a theme we'll continue to see with the next 2 generations. Complaints about easy rivals and busted EXP share would all start here, and the game suffered from a complete lack of difficulty because of it. To me, Pokemon's 3D debut is always going to have this mark held against it. But onto the gimmick, Mega Evolution. Still my favorite gimmick personally. Mega Evolution allowed certain Pokemon to exceed their normal evolution line for a new, temporary evolution, more along the lines of how Digimon function. This new evolution usually came with broad stat buffs, although in some cases a stat could fall, like speed, and sometimes even a type change. Mega Gyarados, still not a dragon. Once you acquire the proper Megastone and give it to the associated Pokemon to hold, the holder could Mega Evolve at any point in the battle when on the field. You can only Mega one Pokemon per battle, so if it faints, you've lost it. But if it's sent back to your party, it will remain in its Mega form for the rest of the battle. These transformations were honestly mostly really cool and sometimes pretty meme-worthy, which we'll take a look at Super Saiyan 3 Mega Ampharos now. But there was a pretty big problem with Mega Evolution when it came to Pokemon's competitive scene. While not all introduced in X and Y, as Megas would return in Let's Go and the Generation 3 remakes, Megas were often given to already really good Pokemon, like Salamence, Garchomp, and Tyranitar, 3 pseudo-legendaries viable in their own right. While others were certainly helped by Mega Evolution, it didn't have as big of an impact as it could have on the metagame by shaking things up with previously unusable Pokemon. While Beedrill's a slight exception, finding a big niche for its speed, Pokemon like Mega Kangaskhan eclipsed all of them when it was introduced with its parental bond ability, basically allowing it to attack twice every turn and almost forcing it onto every online battle team trying to rank up. It's important to think about Pokemon from a competitive standpoint from here on out, because without harder difficulties and more post-game content, veteran players can really only look forward to online battling as a way to realize the potential of the game, at least while Game Freak continues to cut corners. Moving on to Generation 7, the only so far without a traditional gym formula, I personally enjoyed the Alola region. While it didn't always hit, the effort on the story doesn't go unnoticed, and even something as weird as the Island Challenge mechanic was enough to invest into a new region. Z moves, not so much though. Replacing Mega Evolution, for the original Sun and Moon at least, Pokemon would hold new Z Crystal items to buff up one of their existing moves. Z Crystals came in 2 varieties, by type or Pokemon specific. We'll take Pikachu for example. If Pikachu is holding the Electrium Z, once activated, one of its electric moves will become Gigavolt Havoc, the electric type Z move that any Pokemon can use. However, it could also hold Picanium Z, and when holding this crystal, Pikachu must know Volt Tackle. If it does, Volt Tackle will become its signature Z move, Catastropica, probably one of the worst named moves of all time. While Z moves did offer a lot more utility to a lot more Pokemon, the one-time use was a hit or miss. Sure, it could be used to overcome a specific barrier, but after its use, the holder no longer benefits from the item. Even worse, it has no item at all. In the follow-ups, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, both Megas and Z moves would coexist, if only for one game. While no doubt cool and honestly fun to have in your party, this didn't do anything to fix the inherent issues with the gimmicks themselves. But we'd scrap them both in Generation 8, easily the most controversial games to date. In the transition to the Switch, it seemed abundantly clear that cutting corners was way more important than a quality game. Let's throw up one of those Genshin Impact comparisons, because this mobile game, upon release, was substantially higher quality than a game produced by the literal largest franchise in the world. And I'm not one to snob about graphics, especially on the Switch, but after Breath of the Wild's insane praise on launch, we all knew the Switch and Pokemon were capable of so much more. And that's not to mention the Dexit controversy, removing roughly 400 Pokemon outright from the game, with the excuse being graphical quality and better animations. If you spent any amount of time online or in the wild area, you'll see the frame rate drops to prove that quality was not of any concern. For once though, the saving grace was the gimmick. Dynamax proves itself by combining some of the best aspects of both Mega Evolutions and Z moves. Dynamax and its Pokemon-specific Gigantamax is a 3-turn buff to any Pokemon on your team, but once again is only available once per game. Not only did your Pokemon receive stat buffs, notably doubling their health for 3 turns, but all of their moves would receive buffed forms like Z moves. Gigantamax Pokemon would receive their own specific move with a new effect. This variety and availability among all Pokemon allowed for tons of counters to develop, and in many cases, gave a lot of Pokemon more staying power. I've played hundreds of hours of Pokemon Sword, and it's a game that I eventually found myself enjoying a lot, despite its faults. But faults, there were many. And the addition of a few hundred Pokemon in the DLC didn't do a whole lot to fix the problems of the base game. And of course, Dynamax was not present in Brilliant Diamond or Shining Pearl, and now it's safe to assume it won't be back come Generation 9. For the last 3 generations, the overall quality of the main series games has been tanking noticeably, most prominent in Sword and Shield and the infinitely glitchy Generation 4 remix. But the Pokemon Company has finally opened up a unique avenue to take the franchise that old and new players will be able to enjoy from a fresh new angle. That comes with Pokemon Legends Arceus. Legends Arceus seems like the first time in a while that the Pokemon Company has been listening to fans. I know I've been asking for a free-ranging RPG for years, and although we already know it isn't fully open world and graphically isn't quite there yet either, this could represent a new split in the Pokemon fandom, giving veterans something brand new to tackle, while new players can still be introduced to the series as it was originally envisioned. But we'll see how it all goes with the release of Arceus. For now, I've been Reggie. This has been the People Like Games history of Pokemon. Let us know what you want to hear next. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, all that YouTuber stuff. We'll be back with some new content soon. Peace.